I was born and raised in Springfield, Missouri. I'm 79 years old now, and if you had asked me 5 years ago how I thought my life would end up, I would have said I'd spend my final years quietly, in the house I'd lived in for decades, surrounded by family. That's not what happened. What happened instead was a betrayal so sharp that it took every ounce of my strength to stand through it. And yet, in the end, it became my greatest victory. My name is Margaret Dawson. Most people in town know me as Maggie. I've lived in the same modest ranch-style home on the edge of Springfield since the early 1970s. My husband, Robert, bought this house for us after returning from military service. We raised our only son, Michael, here. The land around the property, 48 acres of fields and woods, became the backbone of our family. Robert passed away more than 20 years ago, but before he died, he made me promise one thing: never let go of the land unless I was certain it would be protected. He said, "This land will outlive us, Maggie. Guard it." I kept that promise, though I had no idea how important it would become. My son Michael grew up on this land, but somewhere along the way, his values shifted. He became more interested in appearances, in money, in living a life that looked successful rather than being steady. He married a woman named Caroline, and from the moment I met her, I sensed trouble. Caroline was polite in public, but behind closed doors she had little patience for me. She often made comments about how old-fashioned my ways were, or how much space I was taking up in a house that, technically, she reminded me, would one day be Michael's. First I ignored it. I thought perhaps she just needed time to adjust, and maybe I was being too sensitive. But over the years, the hostility sharpened. She began talking openly about selling the land, about building something useful there. A luxury housing development, a private golf course, even a shopping center. I reminded her more than once that the deed was in my name and not theirs. That only made her more determined. What I didn't know at the time was that Michael and Caroline had been meeting with developers behind my back. They had promised those developers access to my land, claiming that once I was out of the picture, they could finalize the deal. I discovered this not because they told me, but because one evening I woke up thirsty, walked down the hall, and overheard them in the kitchen. They thought I was asleep. They were talking to a man I had never seen before. Later I learned he was a real estate lawyer. He was laying out a plan to create a fraudulent will in my name, one that would make it look as though I had left everything directly to Michael, bypassing legal restrictions. Caroline laughed and said, "She won't even know what she's signing. We'll tell her it's a medical document. By the time she realizes, it'll be too late." Michael didn't laugh. He sounded nervous but didn't stop her. That hurt more than anything. My son, the boy I had raised, the boy I had sacrificed for, was willing to let his wife trick me out of the land Robert and I had built our lives on. I returned quietly to my room that night, my heart pounding. But I didn't cry. Instead, I sat awake until morning thinking, if they believed I was frail, naive, and incapable of fighting back, then perhaps that could be my greatest advantage. What they didn't know, and what I had never told anyone, was that 3 years earlier, I had sold a separate parcel of land in Arkansas that my parents had left me. That sale brought in nearly $14 million. Instead of keeping it in a regular account where it could be tracked, I worked with an old friend from high school, Janet Wilcox, who became an attorney specializing in trusts and estates. She helped me move that money into a private trust under a different name, completely separate from my everyday finances. No one in my family knew it existed. On top of that, last year, I had already transferred ownership of my 48 acres in Springfield to a conservation foundation. The deed was clear and final. The foundation's mission was to preserve open spaces from development. My land was now legally protected forever, impossible to sell or convert. I retained lifetime residency rights, meaning I could live there as long as I wanted, but I no longer technically owned the land. Michael and Caroline thought they were plotting to steal an asset I didn't even control anymore. That knowledge gave me strength. I began to plan. I waited. I watched. I documented. I kept a small notebook, hidden in my sewing box, where I recorded everything they said, every suspicious meeting, every comment that revealed their intentions. I wasn't doing it just for myself. I wanted evidence, undeniable proof in case I ever needed it. Their behavior toward me grew bolder. Caroline would suggest, with a smirk, that perhaps I'd be happier in a retirement home where someone could look after me properly. Michael started avoiding me unless he needed something signed. One afternoon, he even brought me a stack of papers, asking me to sign routine insurance documents. I pretended to need more time, set them aside, and later checked them carefully with Janet. As expected, they weren't insurance papers at all. They were the beginning of a transfer authorization. I hadn't signed them, and now I knew they were willing to use outright forgery if needed. The breaking point came when they arranged a formal meeting with a notary, under the guise of updating my will. I agreed to attend, curious to see how far they would go. The notary arrived at the house, set up at the kitchen table, and presented me with documents. Michael and Caroline hovered behind me, watching. I skimmed the first page and saw the words clearly. Last Will and Testament of Margaret Dawson. The beneficiaries were listed as Michael Dawson and Caroline Dawson, sole inheritors of all property, assets, and holdings. I set the pen down and looked at them both. "Do you really think I can't read?" I asked. Caroline's face went pale. Michael stammered something about it being just a draft, but I had seen enough. I excused myself, claiming I wasn't feeling well, and went straight to my room. I called Janet that evening and told her everything. She advised patience. Let them think you're unaware. The more they act, the more evidence you'll have. That was when I realized I wasn't going to confront them head-on. I was going to let them build their own trap step by step, while I quietly prepared the final blow. After the notary incident, I knew Michael and Caroline wouldn't stop. They believed I was weak, that I couldn't think for myself, and that made them reckless. But I wasn't as fragile as they thought. I had Janet by my side, and together we began preparing for what was coming. The very next day, I went to my doctor and asked for a written statement confirming I was mentally fit and fully capable of managing my affairs. I also underwent a neuropsychological evaluation. Both reports came back clear, and I stored them safely. If Michael and Caroline wanted to paint me as incompetent, I was going to make sure the truth was on paper, signed and sealed. Meanwhile, their tactics escalated. One week, Michael brought me another stack of papers, claiming they were routine medical authorizations. When I looked closer, buried inside was a durable power of attorney naming him as the sole decision-maker for all my financial and personal matters. I pushed the papers back across the table. "I'll think about it," I said calmly. That night, I scanned every page and sent them to Janet. Caroline was even bolder. She scheduled what she called a wellness check at a senior facility in town, but it turned out to be a sales pitch for assisted living. At one point, she even asked if they could do a quick guardianship screening. I didn't sign a single document, but I recorded the entire visit. Janet told me it was exactly the kind of evidence that could expose their intentions. Soon after, a petition for emergency guardianship arrived at my door. They had filed it in court, naming Michael as my guardian. The claims were the same tired lies: confusion, forgetfulness, inability to manage bills. But they had no medical evidence. Just Caroline's affidavit full of vague accusations. The hearing was set for the following week. I didn't panic. I gathered everything: the doctor's statement, the evaluation, copies of my bills paid on time, and proof that my property had already been placed in a conservation trust years earlier. Michael and Caroline thought they were about to seize a multi-million-dollar estate. They didn't realize it was no longer mine to give. Janet suggested one more step: let them talk freely, in a setting where every word could be recorded. So we invited them to her office under the pretense of clarifying my estate plans. They arrived eager and confident, folders in hand. Janet asked me simple questions first about how I paid my bills, how I handled my mail, what I did when I had questions. I answered directly. Then she turned to Michael and Caroline. Caroline couldn't help herself. She bragged about already having buyers lined up for the land. When Janet asked if they had checked the title, they admitted they hadn't. When pressed for details, they grew vague, frustrated, and careless. Every word was typed by the court reporter sitting quietly in the corner. That night, Michael tried one last time. He came to my room and told me guardianship was temporary, that once the will was updated, everything would be smooth. His voice cracked between persuasion and anger. I told him calmly, I already took steps years ago to protect what matters. Nothing you do can change that. He didn't understand then, but he would soon. The hearing was only days away, and I had everything I needed. Evidence, witnesses, and the truth. They thought they had cornered me. In reality, they were walking into a trap of their own making. The morning of the guardianship hearing, I woke up before the alarm. I dressed carefully, navy cardigan, pressed slacks, nothing fancy, just neat. I packed the red folder with my doctor's letters, evaluation results, and exhibits. Janet arrived to pick me up. She was calm, methodical, the way I remembered her from high school debates when she used to dismantle opponents point by point. At the courthouse, the hallway outside the probate division was crowded. Michael and Caroline were already there. Caroline wore a tailored suit, her hair styled sharp. She looked like she was arriving for a business deal, not a family hearing. Michael stood stiff beside her, flipping through a folder as if he were the one about to present evidence. They didn't acknowledge me when Janet and I walked by. That suited me just fine. When our case was called, we entered the small courtroom. The judge, a woman in her late 50s, sat at the bench. A court clerk and a bailiff were present. The atmosphere was formal but not intimidating. I had been in this courthouse before for mundane things, property taxes, Robert's probate years ago, but today the air felt heavier. Michael's lawyer, the man who had introduced himself at my door as Mr. Kraus, was there too. He shuffled papers nervously, his suit slightly wrinkled. Janet had warned me. He wasn't licensed in Missouri. She had printed proof from the Bar Association. That would come out soon enough. The judge began by asking Kraus to present the petition. He launched into a rehearsed speech about concern for my well-being, my supposed confusion, and the need for Michael to step in as guardian. He referenced unsafe incidents, the stove left on, unpaid bills, wandering behavior. My jaw tightened, but I stayed quiet. Janet had told me silence would be my weapon until the right moment. The judge asked for supporting documentation. Kraus handed over Caroline's affidavit. The judge skimmed it, then looked up. Do you have medical records or evaluations supporting incapacity? Kraus hesitated. We are still in the process of obtaining them, Your Honor. Janet rose smoothly. Your Honor, before we proceed further, I would like to present Exhibit A. She handed the clerk a packet. My physician's letter, dated just last week, stating clearly that I was fully competent. Exhibit B, she continued. A neuropsychological evaluation from an independent specialist, confirming the same. She placed copies in front of Kraus and the judge. The judge read for a moment, then raised her eyes. Mr. Kraus, why was this not addressed in your petition? Kraus stammered something about not being aware of recent evaluations. Caroline leaned forward, whispering urgently to him, her face flushed. Janet didn't stop there. She presented Exhibit C, the conservation deed recorded years ago, showing the land was already transferred to the foundation and permanently protected. This means, Your Honor, that even if guardianship were granted, there is no estate for petitioners to control. The property in question is not Mrs. Dawson's to dispose of. That landed like a hammer. Michael's eyes darted to Caroline, whose mouth opened slightly as if she had been slapped with cold water. The judge looked back at Kraus. Were you aware of this transfer? He muttered. No, Your Honor. Janet then introduced Exhibit D, the recording from the senior facility, where Caroline had asked about guardianship screenings. The audio played in the courtroom. Caroline's voice was clear, unmistakable. Can we do a quick guardianship screening? Silence followed. Caroline's face turned pale. Exhibit E was the police report documenting suspicious activity at my house, and Exhibit F was the Bar Association record showing Kraus's lack of Missouri license. Janet slid it across the table like a final card in a poker game. The judge picked it up, scanned the lines, and frowned. Mr. Kraus, are you currently authorized to practice law in this state? He swallowed hard. No, Your Honor, I am licensed in Kansas. The judge's voice sharpened. This is a Missouri guardianship petition. You have no standing here. You will sit down. From that moment, the hearing was effectively over. The judge turned to Michael and Caroline. You have filed a petition based on hearsay, without medical evidence, with an unlicensed representative, and with clear evidence of ulterior motives regarding property already outside of Mrs. Dawson's ownership. This court finds the petition not only without merit but bordering on abuse of process. She paused, looking directly at them. If further frivolous petitions are filed, sanctions will be considered. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. The silence in the room said everything. When the judge dismissed the case, Janet and I gathered our papers. Michael looked at me. His face twisted between anger and disbelief. Caroline refused to meet my eyes. They walked out quickly, whispering harshly to each other. That should have been the end, but it wasn't. A week later, the local newspaper ran a small article about the failed guardianship case. They had pulled the public filings. The headline was blunt. Couple's guardianship petition against elderly mother rejected. The article mentioned the Conservation Trust and noted that the land was legally untouchable. Word spread fast in Springfield. At church, neighbors came up to me, shaking their heads, saying they couldn't believe Michael and Caroline had stooped so low. Worse for them, Benton and Lyle, the developers, learned the truth. They had already invested money in preliminary plans. When they discovered the land was off-limits, they were furious. They sent Michael and Caroline a demand letter for damages, claiming they had misrepresented ownership. I didn't see the letter myself, but a neighbor who works at the courthouse told me a civil case was being discussed. Caroline's social circle evaporated almost overnight. The same women she had boasted to about future millions now avoided her at the market. Michael's business, a contracting firm he had been trying to expand, lost clients. No one wanted to deal with a man who had tried to railroad his own mother into guardianship for profit. One evening, about 2 months after the hearing, I walked downtown to pick up some prescriptions. On the corner I saw them, Michael and Caroline, standing together, arguing quietly. They looked worn, thinner, their clothes less polished. Caroline glanced at me and quickly looked away. Michael's shoulders sagged. For a moment I thought about saying something. But what words could I offer? Pity? Anger? In the end I just walked past. Sometimes silence is the sharpest response. At home that night, I sat in Robert's old armchair and thought about everything that had happened. For years I had believed that protecting the land was about honoring his memory. I hadn't realized it would also become the weapon that revealed my son and his wife for who they truly were. Janet visited me the next day. She was satisfied but cautious. They may try again in some other way, she said. But you've built walls they can't climb. The land is safe. Your finances are safe. The truth is on your side. I nodded. For the first time in months I felt real peace. What I didn't know then was that the consequences for Michael and Caroline were only beginning. Their fall would go deeper, and I would witness it with my own eyes. The civil case from Benton and Lyle hit them hard. The developers accused them of fraud and demanded repayment for the money wasted on preliminary surveys, designs, and marketing. Michael tried to claim it was a misunderstanding, but the documents he had signed told another story. The case dragged through the courts for months, draining what savings they had left. At the same time, Michael's contracting business fell apart. Clients didn't trust him anymore. Rumors spread quickly in a town like Springfield. If he'd betray his own mother, people whispered, what chance do the rest of us have? Within half a year, his company closed its doors. Equipment was sold off at auction and debts piled up. Caroline fared no better. Friends she once bragged to about millions in the bank stopped returning her calls. Even her own sister told me quietly that Caroline had burned every bridge she walked on. They sold their car, then the jewelry Caroline had once flaunted, until all that was left was the house they had mortgaged to keep afloat. Eventually the bank claimed even that. One rainy evening, about a year after the guardianship fiasco, I saw them again. I was leaving the grocery store when I noticed two familiar figures sitting on a bench near the bus stop. Michael and Caroline, soaked through, holding a single duffel bag between them. They didn't see me at first. For a moment I considered walking on. Then I stopped. I reached into my purse and pulled out a $10 bill. I walked up, placed it in Michael's hand and said quietly, "For the bus. It's more dignity than you offered me." He didn't look up. Caroline's eyes filled, but she said nothing. I walked away without waiting for thanks. At home, I sat in Robert's chair and let out a long breath. The land was safe. My finances were secure. And the people who had plotted to strip me of everything had nothing left but each other. It wasn't joy I felt. Not exactly. But there was peace. And peace, after all that had happened, was victory enough.